Bibliophiles of the internet, we have somehow made it to the end of January, which makes absolutely no sense to me, but that means it's time to share my January wrap-up. In terms of reading, my January got off to an incredible start. I do not want to waste any time here. Let's just jump right in. In possibly my most masochistic move to date, I decided to make my first read of 2022 be Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee, read by Andrew Kishino. I don't even know what to say. This is the third and final book in the Greenbone saga. To go off the synopsis for the first book, it is a sprawling epic urban fantasy series set in an Asian-inspired world heavily dictated by politics, blood feuds, and magic. It mostly takes place on the island of Keikon, which is the only place in the world that can organically produce jade, a substance that those with the proper heritage and training can wear to grant themselves superhuman abilities. When a new illegal drug surfaces that allows foreigners to mimic jade powers without regulations, tensions between the two most powerful crime families reaches a breaking point as they struggle to monopolize the jade market and they erupt into open war and violence. Content warnings for graphic violence, injury, murder, and death, some infidelity, some internalized ableism, brief reference to past miscarriage and abortion, PTSD, mentions of terrorism, corporal punishment, mentions of suicide, some descriptions of withdrawal, and graphic gun violence. Fonda Lee has hurt me so much throughout this series, and this final book was no exception. It was an absolute emotional and mental gut punch. Before I get lost in the sauce, there is a fantastic discussion between Fonda Lee and the audiobook narrator Andrew Kishino on the overall development of the series and how they both understand the characters and approach the story from different perspectives. It does contain some mild spoilers for the series, but I found it to be almost cathartic to hear them discuss the series in depth after I had finished it, so I will link that down below and I highly recommend it. What is there to say about this book? I know I'm not going to do it any kind of justice, but it is everything I could have wanted. It is an incredibly slow-boiling epic finale that brilliantly balances action and politics. That has been one of the most gripping parts of the saga in the way it explores that wars are not only fought in the streets, they're fought in boardrooms and restaurants and corporate offices. They're won with power and influence. It's really fascinating to see how that power comes to be because physical intimidation and violence do come into play, but they don't tell the whole story. Yes, there are bloodbaths and turf wars and all these other dramatic exchanges, but who comes out on top is determined by physical, mental, corporate, and political strength. While this series can be explosive at times, it's also subdued. It's about playing the long game. It's about perfectly executing this never-ending game of mental chess. And I think that's what makes it so brilliant because you're on the edge of your seat whether the characters are locked in combat or they're sitting in a boardroom meeting. You are acutely aware that things could very easily go bad even in the safest, most innocuous places. The evolution of time throughout this series is also something that kind of blows my mind because we get to see how these clans evolve over very long periods of time. You get to witness the entire life cycle of some of these characters. Characters who were introduced as babies grow up, characters who started as adults pass away, and the power structures within the clans and the families are constantly shifting to adapt. And to that end, I think one of the most powerful aspects of this series has always been how it explores and interrogates filial piety, and that is only heightened not only by the mafia dynamic, but also through the lens of Asian cultures that inspires and informs this world. I cannot personally comment on that aspect, so I won't, but it is present. My point is that the story really explores that feeling of being secondary in your own life because the family and the clan has to come first. One of the most compelling ideas that was echoing throughout this installment was the sentiment that the choice that's right for you in this moment will not always serve you in the future because your circumstances can change. Time and time again, that's what's so gut-wrenching about this series because it shows how one throwaway person or choice from years and years ago can become a legacy or a prophecy over time and how the past effectively informs and dictates the present. And going back to the family element, this series shows how family can be both the cause of your greatest joys and your greatest power, but also your greatest pain and failings. I physically cannot talk about this series anymore right now. I don't even know if I had a point somewhere in there. It is very much the epic trilogy that hurts you and heals you in equal measure. Just like the first two books, it fucked me up real good, and I gave it 5 stars. Picking a book to follow up after an epic trilogy finale is a lot of pressure, so I decided to go about it by swerving very hard in a very different direction and finally listening to The Heart Principle by Helen Huang, read by Brian Nishi and Natalie Naudis. I got this audiobook as an ALC from Libro FM last year, and I finally got a chance to listen to it. This is the second companion book of sorts in the Kiss Quotient series. It's a contemporary adult romance about an autistic Chinese-American musician named Anna who went viral for one of her concert pieces and has been feeling increasingly burned out ever since. Just just when she thinks that things can't get any more complicated, her long-term boyfriend tells her that he wants them to have an open relationship before they get married so that they can make sure they really want to commit. Anna decides that she's going to shake things up by trying to have one-night stands herself, hoping that this will get her out of her musical rut as well, and she meets this tattooed motorcycle riding guy named Kwan on a dating app. As they get closer over a series of failed hookup attempts, their relationship is tested when Anna and her family suddenly have to become full-time caretakers for her father after he suffers a major stroke. Content warnings for some internal and external ableism, explorations of cancer, some descriptions of panic attacks and overstimulation, discussions about infertility, some self-harm and suicide ideation, in-depth explorations of caretaking, death, and grief, and some explicit sexual content. Before I forget, I do want to point out that Kwan is canonically queer. Everyone in his life uses gender-neutral terms to refer to his dating history, and on the dating app he mentions being matched with people across the gender spectrum, so he is very much a queer love interest. To be fully transparent, I didn't know if I would read this book when it first came out. The Kiss Quotient remains one of my favorite romances ever, and I personally did not love The Bride Test, which was really disappointing for me to realize at the time. So when this book was announced, I didn't have any strong feelings about it. I didn't have any conviction to read it. It was really those early reviews that convinced me to give it a try, and I'm so glad I did, because now I can confidently say that this is one of Helen Huang's best. First of all, I have to say that this is unquestionably a romance. It is absolutely working towards romantic love and acceptance and hope through all of life's difficulties, and to me that more than satisfies the definition of romance. Secondly, this is one of the most intense and real romances that I've ever read. It unflinchingly confronts so much of life's ugliness and pain, and it does so in a way that's honest and unapologetic. What Anna is dealing with on a personal level with her family is not easy, and the story doesn't pull any punches in that respect. She is given the space to feel the guilt, the sadness, the grief, the resentment, and even the selfishness that comes into play with her father's situation. It is honestly painful to read at times, even if you haven't personally been in that situation, so definitely tread carefully and consider the content warnings, but I think you can tell that it comes from a very real place, and that's what makes it also feel cathartic. The dynamic between Anna and Kwan really carries the story, because not only is there a chemistry and sincerity between them, but because they're both fighting their own battles. At the end of the day, I think that's what relationships look like in real life. It comes down to how you show up for your partner or partners during the really tough times. And the story really takes both characters through the lowest points in their lives, where they're doubting themselves and being crushed by the pressure and expectations of other people, and it really becomes a question of how they're going to come back from those things. I also really appreciate how the story spotlights the fact that many caretakers in this country are women, especially women of color, and their labor often goes unpaid and unvalued and unnoticed. It's also deeply cultural in that it becomes a familial duty that many people of color will inevitably face. Honestly, I'm kind of blown away by this story because on the surface, it almost shouldn't work. The first half is a traditional sweet, meet-cute type romance, and the second half is a gritty drama that almost feels like a psychological thriller where everything is very clearly wrong and horrifying and no one is doing anything about it until it reaches a breaking point. And yet there is harmony between those two disparate parts. The foundation of romance in the first half both sustains and challenges Anna as she's dealing with her family in the second half, and it becomes about how she's going to reconcile those two sides. I think this story is one that's equally painful and romantic, and it's ultimately about learning to stand up for yourself, recognize your boundaries, and ask for help when you need it, even if all those things are really hard to do in practice. You don't have to earn your happiness just like you don't have to earn your pain. You don't have to justify them or weigh them against anyone else's for them to be real, and I think that's what's being explored in this book. All of that said, there was one instance where the characters did that thing where they had sex instead of talking, which is what they needed to do, and that gave me brief flashbacks to The Bride Test, but I ultimately found this relationship to be much more satisfying. I am once again a believer, and I gave this 4.5 stars. After that, I picked up my arc of Ophelia After All by the one and only Raquel Marie. This comes out very soon on February 8th from Macmillan. It's a queer YA coming-of-age story about a questioning Cuban-American girl named Ophelia who is known by her friends and family for being equally obsessed with both gardening and boys, and she is known as the resident hopeless romantic. So she finds herself feeling very confused when she starts crushing on a girl in her government class, which unlocks a lot of self-doubt. Now she's questioning her understanding of her self-image, and with graduation getting closer and closer, her once solid friend group is also fracturing a bit as the pressure and stress and uncertainty grows. As Ophelia's distress starts to bleed into every aspect of her life, she has to choose whether to cling to the fantasy version of herself that she's always projected, or to open herself up to the possibility of discovering who she really is. Content warnings for some explorations of racism and colorism, some internal and external experiences with homophobia and lesbophobia, and brief allusions to homophobic slurs. First of all, I have to say I think this book is perfect for fans of 1500 Miles from the Sun, which honestly, from me, is the absolute highest praise. Now, I want to be clear that 1500 Miles is both a coming-of-age story and a romance, and this story is a coming-of-age story that's not necessarily about romance. But they have so much overlap. They're both set during that same time period towards the end of senior year. They both center that messy ride-or-die friend group. They're both about self-discovery and self-acceptance, and of course, they explore understanding your queerness through a Latina lens. So I stand by that. I think if you enjoyed one of these books, you'll enjoy the other, and I cannot say enough good things about both stories. I think Ophelia, after all, perfectly captures that feeling of your final high school moments. That is perhaps the scariest, most exciting, most tumultuous time in a teenager's life, and the story beautifully explores the ups and downs of those experiences. These characters are excited for their futures, but the fear of the unknown is looming over them, and because they know so much about their lives is about to change, they're desperate to cling to their familiar dynamic. That's what's really happening with Ophelia, especially because she's terrified that naming her queerness is not only going to change what her future might look like, but she's also worried that it might undermine or differently color the person she's been up to this point. The misconception that queer identity inherently changes everything that came before it is such a pervasive myth that keeps so many queer youth especially from feeling able to claim their queerness. I appreciate how the story confronts that idea head-on and painstakingly shows how Ophelia is both the same person she's always been and also someone who's continuing to learn about herself and grow into something new, and that's okay. Ophelia's story arc is really powerful, I think, because the fact that she's repressing this really profound part of herself leads to a lot of internal strife. She ends up making tons of mistakes, hiding her feelings, lashing out at people she loves, and detaching herself from activities and people that used to ground her and give her a sense of purpose. To me, that tracks when you think about how burdensome it is to actively deny yourself any sense of authenticity. I just think it's so important how forthcoming this story is about the fact that growing into the person you were always meant to be is often accompanied by a whole lot of discomfort, uncertainty, and messiness. Most importantly, what I'm going to remember about this story is that it celebrates the fact that one of the most important kinds of love is the love we have towards ourselves. It is so rare in queer YA fiction to have stories where the endgame isn't to fall in love or to realize your queerness through dating or action. Instead, this story says that maybe the happily ever after begins with discovering, seeing, and accepting yourself. Ophelia doesn't have everything figured out by the end. She doesn't have a moment where everything magically slots into place and she suddenly has all the answers about herself. But rather, she's in the process of learning that even in her imperfection and uncertainty, she is truly enough. This is one of the most engaging and meaningful YA contemporary stories I've read in such a long time. I will link my written review down below because there is so much more I could say that I just can't fit in this space. But this book has everything. It's fun, it's funny, it's nostalgic, it's genuine, it has a dynamic friend group, it has a great message. I loved it, and I gave it 5 stars. Afterwards, I decided to pick up my arc of Golden Boys by Phil Stamper. This is also coming out on February 8th from Bloomsbury. It's another queer YA coming-of-age story that's kind of pitched as like a modern-day Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, but without the pants and with gay boys. So it's about these 4 queer guys, Gabriel, Sal, Heath, and Reese, who are best friends, and the summer before their senior year of high school is the first time they're going to be apart, and they're all embarking on these epic summer adventures. Gabriel is going to save the trees in Boston, Sal is interning on Capitol Hill, Heath is going to work at his aunt's arcade in Daytona Beach, and Reese is going to do a design program in Paris. So it's about how they try to stay connected with each other as they also try to grow and grapple with these new, stressful, exciting life experiences. Content warnings for some depictions of anxiety, explorations of divorce, references to past bullying and homophobic slurs, instances of underage drinking, some brief descriptions of nicotine addiction, and allusions to sexual content. This was actually another case of love the author's debut, really didn't like their second book, unsure of what their third book might hold, but I have to say, I think Phil Stamper came back very strong. I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this. First, I have to admit that I'm a sucker for the whole Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants setup because I reread those books a million times growing up, so having this story about 4 friends trying to keep in touch over the summer was very nostalgic. I think Phil Stamper really nails that dynamic of trying to balance growing as an individual with also growing as a friend when both are equally important. Being apart for the first time is forcing these friends to quickly learn more about themselves, their needs, and and communicating those needs in healthy and effective ways. It's about navigating that line and figuring out the difference between recognizing when you can do something on your own and when you should lean on your friends. That was one of the more compelling parts of the story for me, because you see the characters learning the hard way that they might be codependent in unhealthy ways. They might be using their friends as a safety blanket instead of as support. So now that they're really and truly on their own, they're learning a lot about themselves and figuring out what they can handle and what they can't. Kind of like Ophelia After All, I also appreciate the complexity of the friend group. Some of them are closer than others, some might be in love with each other or not. There's a lot of different emotions underscoring their collective dynamic. I really enjoy the texture that brings to the story, but it also opens the door for the characters to explore new connections with each other as well. Especially being apart and being on different schedules and different time zones, they might be forced to interact more with someone in the group who's not necessarily their go-to. So that's refreshing, because even though they all consider themselves best friends, they still have room to grow and they're still learning about new facets of their relationships. I think all the characters are pushed to the breaking point in some way, but the story is still incredibly hopeful because it's very much centered and grounded in this foundation of friendship. There's also a bit of a multimedia aspect to this book, which I thought was really fun. And it's not always done in the same way. There's text messages and group chats, but there's also voicemail transcripts and FaceTime transcripts, and you also get to see one of the characters' planner pages as well. So overall, it captures that fun summer feel, but it still has that emotion, it still shines light on those growing pains in really thoughtful ways, and it has that satisfying element of self-discovery as well. I had a good time with it, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I also picked up my arc of Goliath by Tochi Onyebuchi. This recently came out on January 25th from Tor.com. If you were part of the original Quarantine Pages family, you may recall that this was the book Tochi talked about in his interview with Brittany that I believe he described as gentrification in space. This is sort of a fever dream of a story that patchworks together a ton of different characters and perspectives. It's set in the 2050s, where the planet has basically been left for dead, and those with the privilege and means to do so have set off to colonize space. The story follows the people who have been left behind on Earth, mostly Black, Latina, and Afro-Latina folks, and how they're trying to rebuild and navigate what's left. Content warnings for depictions of vomit, references to rape, graphic instances of drug use and addiction, descriptions of corpses, murder and death, racism, anti-blackness, and racial slurs, references to lynching and suicide, descriptions of police brutality, incarceration, violence, and gun violence. This is a really tough book to review because it's incredibly cerebral and abstract. It's a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of a story where the reader is almost secondary or maybe even tertiary to the storytelling experience. It refuses to hold your hand in any sense, and that's something I really respect. Reading this almost gave me the same feeling as when I read Nine Fox Gambit, not in terms of plot or tone or anything, but because it was that same experience of reading this challenging experimental sci-fi world written by an author of color, and knowing that it would be diminished or dismissed because it is quote-unquote not easy to understand. I am being completely honest when I say this is not a story you can just breeze through. It requires attention, it forces you to engage, but I think the payoff is worth that little bit of work. All of that aside, what really struck me about this story is its sense of urgency. It's set in the not-so-distant future, and even though it paints a completely different planetary landscape, it feels eerily familiar and realistic. It reads more like an inevitable trajectory for humanity as opposed to a fictional, futuristic projection. And I think what Tochi has highlighted so well is that the issues underserved communities are facing now are the same ones they've always faced and the same ones they will continue to face if nothing changes. This vision of the future illustrates how even after the system collapses, it will still continue to function as intended to further marginalize already vulnerable folks. I think that's what's so amazing about science fiction, the fact that it can remove us so far from reality, but when it's done well, that distance is merely a reflection of the way the world truly is. I think the question at the heart of this story is, how do we understand and determine value, especially when it comes to society, especially when it comes to community, especially when it comes to people? What kind of legacy are we imparting when we become comfortable with erasing people and leaving them behind? And who are we allowing to be heroes? I think the story presents a really interesting take on those questions, and even though I had some minor issues with the structure of the story at times, I still think it gets that message across very effectively. I gave this 4 stars. And the most recent book I finished was, of course, The Silvered Serpents by Roshni Chokshi. This was my Patreon pick for January, so thank you to my patrons for enabling me and letting me continue on with this series. As a broad overview, this is the second book in a YA historical fantasy trilogy set in the late 1800s in France. It follows this highly secretive society known as the Order of Babel, who are tasked with collecting and protecting various ancient artifacts and articles of creation that possess powerful and potentially dangerous magic. The idea Narnia is based on the Tower of Babel, which is a creation story that basically says when the Tower of Babel was destroyed, its pieces were scattered all across the world and became the various cultures and languages that we know today. And if those pieces were to be reunited, it would have some very serious consequences. The Order is broken up into different houses who are safeguarding those pieces, and our main cast of characters are treasure hunters who are both working for and against the Order to make sure that those pieces don't fall into the wrong hands. Content warnings for references to stillbirth, infant death, human sacrifice, suicide, and anti-Semitism, some descriptions of dismemberment and graphic violence, some experiences of grief, and some allusions to death and abuse. I will also once again point out that this series has representation for characters who are biracial, Algerian, Haitian, Indian, Filipino, Jewish, queer, and autistic. I am once again upset that this series continues to be so incredibly good. It has defied and surpassed every single one of my expectations. It's rich, it's imaginative, it's unexpected, and it is so well executed. I truly do not understand how Roshni Chokshi has so perfectly blended beautiful prose and historical nuance, mythological world building, and fairy tale-esque imagery and magic. The world building, the style, the voice, it all comes together to really make something unforgettable. I could talk for hours, unprompted, about the found family in this series. That was definitely one of my biggest praises for the Gilded Wolves, and I continue to be both fascinated and terrified by the depth of that dynamic. This second book especially is such a gut punch because it takes that found family aspect and it twists it just a little because all the characters are still irrevocably connected to each other, but now their relationships have become just a little bit more hesitant. All of them are reeling from the events of the first book and some trauma that stems from that, and it's created a bit of distance between them as they figure out their next steps. They're still working together towards a common goal, they're still hunting these forbidden items as a team, but the trauma has brought out some desperation in each of them, and they're each struggling in their own way to prove themselves. So the drama, the emotion, and the action are working on multiple levels, because you have this overarching treasure hunt they're working on, but then underneath that they all have separate motives, and in some cases, secrets. So the stakes and circumstances have not only changed, but they've been significantly upped in this installment, which I didn't think was possible after the first book. And as a piece of historical fantasy, I have so much respect for this series. Not only does it openly critique colonization and Western centrism, but it also restores dignity, beauty, and importance to previously erased cultures and belief systems, and non-Eurocentric histories are often the key to unlocking many of these mysteries. To show how these mythologies and cultures are not merely accessories, but in fact the root, the blueprint, the answer to these profound questions is extremely powerful when you think about it. I was right to be terrified of where this series might go because it has tightened its emotional chokehold on me and it has hurt me in ways that are both profound and yet to be seen. I am just in awe of how Roshni Chokshi is able to pull this series together. It is absolutely mind-blowing. The character work, the relationships, the mysteries and suspense, all of it is top-notch. I gave this 4.5 stars. I also happen to be taking part in Pondathon 2. I will have links down below to explain what that is if you don't know, but basically I read these 6 books and I also wrote some words, so by the end of January, this is what my terrarium looks like. And it's pretty heckin' cute, if I do say so myself. So those are all the books I read in January. Full disclosure, I am filming this a little bit early, so I might finish something else before the month ends. If I do, it will be reviewed somewhere, some way, somehow, so we'll see what happens. As always, if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to drop a comment down below and let me know what you think. But that is everything I have for this wrap-up today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.